When do you know it's time to let go? It's a question in life that can be incredibly difficult to answer, but in mixed martial arts, it might be the hardest question of all. We have seen so many of the best to ever do it linger in this sport well past the height of their glory. We've seen countless legends hold on to this sport with a death grip and do everything in their power to keep stepping into that cage. No matter how many fights they've lost, how much further down the ladder they've descended from their peak, how painful it is for their biggest fans to see them in the state they end up. But what if those fighters had a crystal ball that would show them how it all would go to the very end? What if they could avoid those sad fates we often see and get the perfect send-off each and every time? A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers for their incredible support in these long-form videos, and this is the exact moment legendary fighters should have retired. Before we start this journey together, you need to know a few things. I realize that not fighting isn't always an option. There are bills to pay and there are mouths to feed, and this is how these people make their money. Even if they were financially secure, some of them simply didn't want to let go of the sport for one reason or another. And who am I or anybody else outside their own circle to tell them to stop? So keep that in mind as you watch this video. I'm not saying at all that I'm some authority over when these fighters should have walked away. This is a fan's perspective on when I wish they'd have retired. That perfect send-off that encapsulates their career from the perspective of we the fans who loved these fighters, with perfect 2020 hindsight. Final note, I'm not doing fighters who are still active because that's just rude. Alright, now that you know where I'm coming from and what I'm not trying to do, we're going to go through these by order of date of their last fight. And so that means we're going to be starting with one of the sadder entries on this list. One of the careers that carried the most promise, but that self-destructed under the weight of everything going on in his life. We're starting with the bitter ending of Mark Kerr's career.
At the end of this whole run here, I was left holding absolutely nothing. Now, as far as what I was in it for, you'd ask me and I'd be like, I don't know why I'm in it.
Mark Kerr's last dance would take place nearly a decade after he was fighting in a sold-out Tokyo Dome, 50,000 plus in attendance, to see the opening round of the Pride 2000 Grand Prix, the premier event in the entire sport at the time, and one many thought he could win. 9 years later, he was fighting at Memorial Hall in Kansas City, a building that holds a maximum capacity of 3,500 people, in an M1 Global Challengers event. His purpose on that night, to be fodder for the upcoming King Mo in just his 5th professional bout. Kerr would last 25 seconds before ending up in a heap on the mat.
Goes for a single leg, and they go to canvas early, and starts pounding.
Oh man,
Kerr in trouble. Oh, the mouth guard's gone. The big kibosh. It's over. It's over. It's over. And Mark Kerr, surely the career is over now, Guy Meska.
It was his 5th loss in a row and his 10th loss in his last 12 fights. The dream was dead, but it had honestly died a long time ago. It's well documented that Kerr struggled with substance abuse, as well as his mental health.
I'd met some people that would go pharmaceutical shopping in Mexico. Anything you wanted, benzodiazepines, Percocets, Darvocets, and then you start getting the liquid injectable stuff,
They're not sure that he's gonna make it. He can't stay awake for more than 30 seconds. I think he pretty much went wild, went crazy, just did everything he could get his hands on.
And it was these issues, along with other contributing factors, that throttled a potential all-time career. While the 2-time UFC tournament winner would remain unbeaten up to the 2000 GP, after losing to Kaz Fujita in the 2nd round and then failing in back-to-back bouts in Pride 12 and 15, he'd take a 3-year break from the sport, only to return looking like an entirely different person, knocking himself out while attempting a takedown in the first 40 seconds of his bout with Yoshihisa Yamamoto.
He's gonna lift him up like this. And the takedown by Kerr.
Oh, this is not right. Look at this. Oh my God, what happened? I think
Did he knock himself out?
The next 5 years would take us up to that moment against King Mo in front of a few thousand people. While Kerr's continued career over the early 2000s was no doubt out of necessity, he has said that his opioid abuse lasted up to 2013, well through the end of it. I don't know if him being away from the sport would have added to his issues or helped him, but when he took his break in 2001, that should have been the last time Mark Kerr ever fought. We never should have seen him in the state he was in by the time of that return and everything that followed after. My hope being that in that scenario, his road to recovery would have been easier as a result.
It's about going out and entertaining and having a great time doing it.
So you're definitely not done?
No, not done.
Luckily, not every story in this video is going to be that heavy. Sometimes fighters just held on for a little too long. One of them was Matt Hughes. The legendary welterweight champion's final bout took place in 2011 against Josh Koscheck. The fight previous, he'd been KO'd by BJ Penn in just 21 seconds.
We're in the backstage. We're getting our drug testing now.
I go, Matt, just wanna, you know what, you're such a nice man. Thank you for telling me good luck before the fight. And he looks at me and says,
I wasn't serious.
This time he would almost make it out of the first round before getting knocked out.
Big hammer fist from Josh Koscheck. Matt's in all kinds of trouble. Final seconds of the round. He's out. He's out cold. It is all over. Josh Koscheck has knocked out Matt Hughes.
We'd recently seen the rapid decline of another legend in Chuck Liddell, with the UFC luckily stepping in.
We're also here today to announce that he is becoming one of the top executives in the UFC. Thank you, everybody, and love you.
And fans were hoping for a similar intervention for Hughes. It had been 4 years since his final title fight, an interim battle with his great rival George St. Pierre, their championship trilogy ending in his second defeat. Matt Hughes ushered in the modern era of the sport and was one of its greatest champions, but that legacy was already etched in stone, and there was not going to be anything added to it. Despite being unable to initially conceive retirement,
have you made a decision whether or not this will be your last fight? No.
A cushy job at UFC HQ alongside Liddell ensured Hughes had a purpose after hanging up the gloves, and he conceded. But that was not at all the perfect time for this story to end. While you could argue that after his final defeat against GSP, such a high-level fighter had no reason to compete anymore, as it was clear there were no more titles in his future, but I disagree. I think the perfect send-off would have been his victory over Matt Serra 2 fights later. Why? It was the last loose thread. Hughes and Serra were meant to have a title bout after they coached a season of Tough together, but Serra got injured and forced that interim title bout with St. Pierre, defeating Serra in a fight of the night effort to complete that last unresolved story arc would have been the perfect way to capstone his career, a fitting send-off for one of the sport's greatest champions.
The bad thing is that we're all competitors. You get that win and then you just want another one and another one, and it's a sickness. You know, we just want to compete.
But there's not always something waiting on the other side of fighting, and often it's difficult for fighters to even conceive what life is supposed to be after their career has ended. After all, these guys aren't retiring in their 60s. Most of them are still in the prime of their life. Such was the case for Jens Pulver, who wrestled with the idea of retirement for 6 years after his final bout in the UFC. We know this because of the incredible documentary about that time period called Driven. The promotion's first ever lightweight champion, who was stripped after 2 successful defenses over a contract dispute, would fight 17 more times with a record of 6-11 after his second UFC tenure, before finally hanging up the gloves following a decision loss to Sami Aziz in November of 2013 at a Swedish regional event. Not the send-off this legend deserved.
It isn't about the money. It's all you know. You trained for it, and you love it.
Many felt that the perfect time for Pulver to retire was following his disastrous return to the UFC in 2006, first KO'd by a debuting Joe Lozon in under a minute.
Good knee, but Lozon again, a left hook. Jens is out. His eyes on. Jens Pulver was a 7-1 favorite for this fight.
Then stopped by former rival BJ Penn after they'd coached a season of The Ultimate Fighter together.
What do I do? How do I learn to figure this shit out? How do I learn to be a businessman? How do I learn to be an everyday individual? How do I learn to enjoy what I'm doing without that competitive edge? I have to retire because I can't mentally put it together.
But I disagree entirely. Pulver's run in the WEC after that created a perfect opportunity. Upon entering the promotion, Jens would be put up against a young and tough up-and-comer, the 11-1 Cub Swanson. It was your classic old being fed to the young scenario, but the plot twist was Pulver would win with an anaconda choke in 35 seconds. Maybe the old man still had it. Was that the perfect time? No, because that would lead to a featherweight title fight with another legend, Uriah Faber. It was one last shot at glory for Jens, and while the scorecards wouldn't reflect it, as Faber would retain with 50s across the board, the bout would end up the fight of the night, was seen by 1.5 million viewers on TV, and was a perfect final showcase for such a legendary fighter who had a not-so-graceful exit from the UFC a year earlier.
I'm one of the baddest men on the planet. I was a world champion, pound for pound at one point, one of the probably I was top 1 or 2 best fighter in the world. Am I something special? No, it's just me. I fought for a different reason.
But not every legend is forced to fight on smaller shows if they do not want to stop competing, like Brazilian royalty Minotauro Nogueira. It seemed like the UFC was willing to let him fight forever, an issue that will become far worse for another fighter we'll talk about later. At a point the best fighter in the world in the early days of Pride FC, Nogueira was already a bona fide living legend by the time he entered the UFC for the first time, and had a pretty respectable run considering he was past his prime. He held interim gold, had a fantastic 2-fight series with fellow grappling elite Frank Mir, and put on a classic with Randy Couture that so perfectly represented the best from Japan and the US at heavyweight from the early 2000s era. But the final 3 years of Nog's UFC run would see him only compete 3 times, lose every bout, get subbed, get knocked out, and end his career in August of 2015, losing via UD to Stefan Struve in Rio.
Man, what was a tough fight, but it's been harder for me be training, be camping. If you go work so hard, like 3 months, doing the camp, get there, you don't get the result like we expect.
But Big Nog deserved a much better send-off, and I have the perfect moment. It's 3 years earlier. Nogueira is coming back off the catastrophic arm break against Frank Mir. He hadn't fought in nearly a year, he was back in front of a Rio crowd, and he would earn the submission of the night, an arm bar over Dave Herman.
But he's gonna go belly down. This is how he submitted Cro Cop. He's got it. It's all over. Minotauro Nogueira. Jiu-jitsu works on everybody, folks.
Yes, it does indeed.
It would have been so damn perfect, and let this legend leave on a high note he deserved, rather than linger pointlessly for 3 more years. I suppose better that, though, than the late career of Kazushi Sakuraba. Do you remember the brutality of his loss to Melvin Manhoef in Dream? I distinctly remember seeing the highlights surface online at the time, and I thought this should probably be the end for Saku. If you'd have told me that he had 8 more fights left in him, I'd have never believed you. That final stretch afterwards saw him go 2-5 up through 2011, followed by a return 4 full years later to fight Shinya Aoki, his final bout on a Rizin New Year's Eve card in 2015. Getting absolutely battered on the ground, his team would be forced to throw in the towel.
And we're seeing that tonight.
And the game is over. About the saddest ending possible to the most legendary Japanese fighter's career. It was awful, and if there's one fighter's fate in this video that I could change, it would be Sakuraba's. Now, I would have said that his rematch with Royce Gracie in 2007 would be the perfect time for him to have retired, given the historical significance of their first bout in Pride. Unfortunately, Royce ruined that with his PED failure. So, given the circumstances, I think the best possible goodbye would have been at the K1 Dynamite New Year's Eve card that same year. Kazushi was faced with fellow legend and founder of Pancrase, Masakatsu Funaki, and would defeat him via Kimura in the main event. Yes, this wasn't some knockdown drag-out fight, but it was a really great little moment with 2 historic fighters that meant so much to the sport and Japan. That was the type of send-off that Sakuraba deserved, not bloodied and beaten down 7 years later. Much like that pairing of Saku and Funaki, had I told you that the final fight of both Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie's careers were against each other, you might say, wow, that is just the most fitting ending possible. But in this case, you would be entirely wrong. The 2 pioneers who so vitally helped shape the early sport in Brazil, Japan, and the US did in fact have their final fight against each other in Bellator in 2016. The fight was a full 9 years since Gracie had competed, his last bout before that being the fight I mentioned with Sakuraba, where he would test positive for steroids. Ken had been more recently active, losing a bizarre comeback bout 8 months earlier against Kimbo Slice after a 5-year hiatus himself. The 2 legends would compete for all of 2 minutes before Shamrock would claim that he was
was hit in the cup, and it certainly looked that way, a foul that went ignored, and started the final sequence that led to Royce winning via TKO. You could not write a worse possible way to have ended the stories of these two legendary fighters, back after way too long in a terrible fight that had a terrible ending. For two of the most important fighters to ever compete, it was just not at all the way things should have gone.
Why didn't you mention it in the cage when Jimmy Smith talked to you right after the fight?
I think I made it really clear when I was in the ring. I was pretty upset. And then after I told Royce in his corner that I apologized to them, why would I keep going with it? I mean, maybe it was just a phantom thing. It didn't happen.
They deserved better, and I know the exact moments they should have walked away. For Royce, this is an easy choice for me. Gracie should have absolutely stopped fighting after his legendary bout with Sakuraba at the Pride Grand Prix 2000 finals. It was his first ever loss. It was this perfect generational passing of the torch moment between what MMA was and what it had become.
He's throwing in the towel in. Kazushi Sakuraba has Gracie quit. Look at the crowd. Listen at the crowd. Standing over your headphones.
It was the ideal capstone to all the contributions that Gracie had made, and just a beautiful moment, with his entire family there by his side. I cannot think of a better send-off, not to mention, if he stops there, we never have to see him battered by Matt Hughes 6 years later, or fail for steroids, or knee Shamrock in Bellator. Hindsight 2020, that legendary moment is it. The best moment to finish up Ken's career is pretty clearly defined too, as everything after his second UFC run was more or less out of necessity to earn money, which, as I stated before, I totally understand, and I'm not saying he shouldn't have done that, but in a perfect world, the last fight of Ken Shamrock's career would have been closing out his trilogy of bouts with Tito Ortiz.
And you just continue to keep talking crap.
It's going to be over. I mean, this
when I step in the ring, you're going to have to prove it's over because I'm coming after you.
To be the pioneer that he was in the 90s, and then to be such a huge part of the early Zuffa UFC's success later, really is a testament to how important Shamrock was to the sport. And so following his big-time fights with Ortiz, even though every single one of them were losses, there was no better time for Ken to say goodbye and be properly thanked for his contributions to the sport.
I just say congratulations to him. I love this sport. I think this sport's the greatest sport in the world, and all the fighters in here have big hearts to step in here and fight. I just want to say God bless everybody. Thank you for the wonderful years. I love you all.
It's crazy to think that these two legends who pioneered the sport in the early 90s retired relatively close to the same time as Michael Bisping, who wouldn't even start competing in mixed martial arts until 2004. But that was the case. The Count's career ending was almost perfect. After a long 10-year journey from winning tough to, in the eyes of many fans, having settled into the role of a highly skilled gatekeeper, Bisping would earn middleweight gold in one of the most shocking and feel-good moments of all time.
He got rocked. Bisping caught him with a left. And again, Michael Bisping is the new UFC middleweight champion of the world.
You know, I mean, this has been a lifetime's work, and I understand why people, didn't believe in me, but because I'd lost some key fights, and I accept that. And that's why I took this fight on short notice. That defines me. I am a fighter.
He followed that up by completing his rivalry with Dan Henderson in his hometown of Manchester, no less. And then this near fairy tale story culminated in Mike headlining one of the biggest cards the UFC has ever had against all-time legend George St. Pierre. Michael would end up losing that bout via a rear naked choke to cap off one of the greatest nights in MMA history. There was no better time to walk away than that moment.
I love doing what I do. I'm from a small town in the northwest of England. I never thought I'd be here headlining Madison Square Garden. I'll be damned if the last time I do it is getting choked out on TV.
He'd won the title. He'd done everything he ever needed to do to cement his legacy as a Hall of Famer. It would have been the perfect time to lay the gloves down in the cage, and would have somehow made one of the best endings of the best cards ever even better. 3 weeks later, Bisping would fill in for Anderson Silva against Kelvin Gastelum in Shanghai and be brutally KO'd in the first round.
Nice 1-2 for Gastelum. Bisping is out. Wow! Gastelum finishes Michael Bisping.
I've done this for a long time, man. I'm getting old. But unfortunately, it's going to take a bigger pile of shit than him to get rid of me.
Afterwards, Jon Anik talked about one more fight in England, a chance to say goodbye to fans, but that never came. Bisping injured his eye against Gastelum and was forced to retire.
After the Gastelum fight, I went to a party. We went to a club, and because it's dark, I just kept seeing this flash out of the corner of my good eye. And I'm like, what the hell? And I kept looking at it. You know, I keep seeing a flash, so I keep looking. And I realized there's no flash going on, it's just my eye. And every time I look left, it flashes. So I started freaking out, thinking, oh my God, I don't believe this. I've got a detached retina in my good eye. And I actually was negotiating with the UFC to fight Rashad Evans in London.
But a lot of guys, if they had lost most of the use of one of their eyes, would have been done.
Probably the smart thing to do would have been one of those guys. This is me. It was my identity, and until I won that belt, I wasn't happy. Now, when I won it, my wife said she wanted me to retire. When I fought Luke in LA, she said, if you win, I want you to retire.
A brutal epilogue to what was a storybook career ending just 3 weeks earlier. Another legend who would see their ending forced on them following a bout was Mirko Cro Cop, who after defeating Roy Nelson in 2019 suffered a stroke.
Sad slijedi mirovina neizbježna. Ja se nadam da se neću rasplakat sad, ali to je to. Ja sam imao problema sa vratom. To sam primijetio kad sam vozio na rikverce, jer zagrlim sjedalo, gledam, čim pogledam iza sebe, neki 10 sekundi hvata me nesvjestica. Ja sam zarotirao glavu 10 puta jednu stranu, 10 puta u drugu i nakon toga sam pao nesvjestan. Imao sam moždani udar.
But Mirko was on a 10-fight win streak going back 5 years. There was a time that Cro Cop was the most feared striker in the whole world, and his Pride FC run was just filled with victim after victim. 16 finishes, tied all-time with Vanderlei Silva. His championship bout with Fedor Emelianenko, one of the biggest fights the sport's ever had. His crowning achievement winning the 2006 Openweight GP. But famously, Mirko would struggle in the UFC afterwards, never earning a single significant victory and seeing himself finished 5 times.
He drops his hands, bang, right on the temple, out cold.
His career rebound after that first UFC run really is remarkable, and had he not been forced to retire, I would say that the perfect time for him to walk away hadn't yet come. But since we have perfect hindsight in this video, I do know the best possible send-off, and that was his return to Pride's spiritual successor, Rizin, in 2016. Riding a 3-fight win streak with 3 finishes, Mirko would enter Rizin's Openweight GP tournament and absolutely mop the floor with everyone, earning 4 wins with 4 finishes, the final 2 victories to win the tournament old school style on the same night on a New Year's Eve show of all things, the biggest card that year in Japan.
Circle his butt back to the center of that cage.
There you go.
Oh, he's down.
Bruno got him. Bruno's down.
It's over.
That's it. Unbelievable.
I think that was over.
Cro Cop, bobbing and weaving.
Oh, left hook by Cro Cop.
See, here's a trouble. That's a knockout.
Cro Cop going for the finish. Are you kidding me? He's the 2016 World Grand Prix champion.
I mean, what better send-off for a Pride legend than that? It would have been absolutely perfect, and I so wish that was his ending. Cro Cop and Bisping were forced to retire because of injuries, and it was incredibly sad that they didn't get to go out on their own terms. But our next legend's forced retirement came as a sigh of relief for most fans. And if there is any fighter on this list who needed a better ending than the one he got, it was BJ Penn. There was a time that the Prodigy was simultaneously one of the most popular, well-respected, and greatest fighters on the planet. The former 2-division UFC champion was anything but in August of 2019, when after a 7-fight losing streak that spanned 8 years, Penn was knocked out in a street fight outside a bar and finally forced to retire.
Punch again. Stop! Keep on!
This one killed me. Baby J is one of my all-time favorites, and of everyone we've spoken about, there may not be a worse career fate. Penn deserved better, and the perfect moment was one that he had thought of himself, his title eliminator with Nick Diaz.
Yeah, I don't fight my friends, and I don't fight people I know. And that's just kind of a rule I have. I don't care about the money. I would never sign a fight for it, so I don't care how much money you put in front of me. I can't do it, man.
No, I was pretty surprised that I wasn't fighting Carlos Condit and that I was fighting Nick Diaz. We train together, we spar together, we grapple together, so fight's a fight, and that's 2 years ago, and I don't know what he's going to come at me with.
I mean, to me, it doesn't matter. I don't really care. I'll fight any of them anytime.
This fight was an instant classic, and even though the outcome was a loss for BJ, it was a glorious final showcase and truly the high point of his late career.
They go the distance. What a fight. BJ Penn, Nick Diaz.
In the injury, and they're still talking, at least.
Declaring the winner by unanimous decision, Nick Diaz!
Is there any joy in this win for you?
I mean, just getting the title, even the fact that...
No, I had to fight somebody I know, had to fight somebody who we might have been friends at some point in time before, you know? Yeah. We could have had training together. They already had brought me on for training.
It was also the start of his abysmal losing streak, one that would see baffling performances and brutal beatdowns. The first thing he told Joe Rogan after fighting Nick,
"It's probably the last time you're ever going to see me in here. I want to perform at the top level. That's it, Joe."
I truly wish it was, because it would have been a fitting send-off and saved both Penn and his fans the 8 years that came after he walked out of the octagon that night. Of course, at the end of the day though, all of these moments I've said fighters should retire are just my opinion, except for Daniel Cormier. He has expressed that he knows exactly when he should have retired, and I completely agree with him. In reality, his end would come after back-to-back losses to Stipe Miocic, first losing his heavyweight title, and then a year later failing to regain it. One of the greatest fighters ever retired in an empty Apex Center to no fanfare whatsoever after being smothered for 5 rounds.
I mean, it is what it is. You know, being on the losing end of 2 big fights and trilogies, it's a very sad position to be in, but I'm not interested in fighting for anything but titles, and I don't imagine there's going to be a title in the future, so that'll be it for me.
It was not the send-off fitting for such an amazing career, and had DC listened to himself, it sounds like it would have been avoided. After his incredible win in the first fight with Stipe to become the heavyweight champion, Cormier had a relatively quick turnaround to beat Derek Lewis on short notice to headline a card in Madison Square Garden, making him the first fighter ever to defend titles in 2 weight classes.
He's got one hook in.
Oh, that's it, Joe.
He's got the neck.
Looks like DC's under that chin.
He's got it.
There's the tap. Daniel Cormier defends his UFC heavyweight title.
History in the making, Daniel Cormier, one of the greatest of all time.
A month later, Cormier was scheduled for back surgery, a procedure that completely altered his ability to fight and train, and one he now says should have ended his career.
When I had that back surgery in 2018 after Derek Lewis, it was over. It was over, you know, and I fought twice since, and you know, I possibly should not have. When I had that back surgery, it so severely limited what I could do. It was pretty much over. I just wasn't the same guy.
Making that win over Lewis, especially knowing that the surgery was upcoming, the perfect moment to walk away from the sport on a truly high note in a legendary venue full of fans instead of a cold, empty warehouse. The same horrible fate that befell our next fighter. I think it was Anderson Silva's inability to let go that ended up making for an incredible opportunity at one point to have a perfect retirement, but it would unfortunately pass. The living legend and greatest middleweight of all time retired after losing via TKO to Uriah Hall on a fight night card at the Apex during the pandemic with no crowd. This was following 7 years with just a single victory. I cannot think of a worse send-off for one of the most important fighters that has ever existed.
I'm enjoying my moment, you know, and sometimes it's very difficult for us to stop. This is my air. This is I do for my entire life and do it with my heart.
But when was the right time? Well, I don't think it was after the leg break. His recovery from that is an important aspect of his story. I wouldn't tell him to stop after the disgrace of failing a PED test following the Nick Diaz fight either. I'm glad he kept going on because his passing of the torch to Israel Adesanya was one of those once-ever type moments in the sport that so perfectly bridged the gap from the greatness that was Anderson and what was to come with Adesanya.
Thank you guys, thank you. You know, I worked my entire life for this sport, and I need to say thank you, God, for giving one more time the great opportunity for give a great show for you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Australia. Thank you, Dana. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.
For most, the outcome on this fight was never in question, but that's not why that fight was important. And even still, it was the last time Anderson Silva ever felt like Anderson Silva. And to have him say goodbye after that incredible moment in front of an adoring crowd would have been the best possible send-off for the Spider. There are probably legends I didn't speak on today that you think deserved better or lingered for far too long, but the reason you didn't see them is because I disagree. For instance, Fedor Emelianenko. I don't think too many would argue that his career probably should have ended after Strikeforce, but I'm glad he eventually ended up in Bellator, and I'm glad he competed for one more world title twice against Ryan Bader. Not to mention the send-off they gave him last year was great. With this big gathering of all these legends, that was a great retirement, and I wouldn't change a thing despite the rough patch he had between Strikeforce and Bellator. My favorite retirement ever is probably one many would assume would end up in this video, and that is Randy Couture. To me, it was the perfect retirement. If you don't recall, this was when he was brutally head kick KO'd by Lyoto Machida. So how can I think that catastrophic ending was perfect for one of my all-time favorite fighters? Well, first, if we don't get to that point, we miss out on two fantastic late career moments. His Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer fight with Mark Coleman, and of course, the MMA versus boxing beatdown of James Toney, which I think would have been the worst possible fight to retire after. It was just far too silly. What makes his loss to Machida so great to me is that it perfectly encapsulated Couture.
Are we gonna see you again?
No, you're not gonna see me again. This was it.
Randy the Natural Couture, ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest that ever was.
This man's entire career was throwing himself headlong into what seemed unwinnable situations. From his rivalry with Chuck, to coming out of retirement to beat Tim Sylvia, to taking on the monster that was Brock Lesnar. The outcome was not always positive, but Couture striving for that greatness, that willingness to put himself in those fights, that is what made him so special. Lyoto Machida had just lost the light heavyweight title 2 fights prior. Nobody expected Randy to win that fight. This was Couture again pushing himself to the limit to compete against the best possible fighters, and the outcome made it clear that he was not on that level anymore. How could Randy have gone out any other way than doing what he'd always done his entire career, trying to be the best? It was perfect, and it was having that kind of meaningful moment that I had hoped for every fighter we talked about today. But now it's your turn. When do you think these fighters should have retired? Who didn't I talk about today that you feel deserved better? Let me know. I want to hear about all of it. A massive thank you to the editor of this video, Luke Taylor. He knocked it out of the park, and he deserves an amazing retirement too whenever he hangs up the gloves, which is gonna be never. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A massive shout to our channel Hall of Famers as well. You guys make this kind of longer content easier to make. We cannot thank you enough. If you'd like to become a channel member, hit that join button. In addition to exclusive content, you might even have some say in our videos. Like and subscribe to Ankle Pick James Toney. Leave those comments down below I just talked about, and have yourselves a fantastic day, guys. Thank you so much for watching.